Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today we're going to focus on some of the major after effects of the Great Depression and the stock market crash. So we're going to look at kind of the immediate effects. Some of these things last for a while. They last through Hoover's presidency into FDR's presidency. Some of them are just more immediate effects. But we're really looking at kind of like after the stock market crashes, what changed in America, how is the Depression affecting the average American citizen. So we're looking at social life here and kind of just the average American's response to the Great Depression. So when you look at the stock market crash, when we look at, say, Black Tuesday, for example, one of the things I mentioned in class, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in every period, but most Americans do not have money in the stock market. So when Black Tuesday happens, most Americans are not losing their life savings. They're not even losing really any money at all. You do have some Americans who invest a significant amount of money in the stock market, and they are losing fortunes, and they are losing a lot of money. But your average American, your average working class American is not investing in the stock market. So what we have to think about is, well, if the stock market crashes, what does this mean for your average, everyday American? And it is going to have a huge effect, a huge ramification on them, even though they don't have money in the stock market. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, if they're not investing in the stock market, some Americans are, but most Americans are not. Why is the stock market crash going to affect your average person? How does it affect the economy at large? And to understand that, you first have to understand what's going on in the stock market. So the stock market is where corporations are basically trading shares in their company. Okay, so people are investing in American companies, and all your big American companies are being traded on the stock market. So all the ones that we've been talking about in class, like the auto industry companies like Ford and Chrysler and GM. Also, you know, your holdover companies from the Gilded Age, like U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, all these companies, and including the new companies, from radios and the new kinds of, innovative technology of the era, they're also being traded on the stock market. So when the stock market crashes, even if I did not invest in the stock market, this is going to affect me because these companies employ millions of Americans. And when you have a system where you have oligopolies, where they dominate a certain industry, a lot of people's employment is hinging upon this one company. And so if a company, let's say on this day, Black Tuesday, loses a significant amount of its value, what that means for them is they've lost investment. They've lost investment in their company. And the business term that you would use is capital. They've lost capital, money that they can use to employ people, to pay for new machines, to run their businesses. This is huge. So when you look at the stock market crash, what you want to think of is not necessarily like the person who's invested in the stock market, what happened to them. What you want to think is what happened to the corporations, what happened to the companies that sell their stock on the stock market. And the answer to that is a lot of them are crushed, they're ruined. And if they're not crushed, they're severely hurt by Black Tuesday and by this stock market crash. And what they have to do is we have to look at the ripple effects of that. What do they do as a company as a result of losing tons of money in one single day? And really, they're going to have to lay people off. They're going to have to cut back. They're going to have to close factories. And that's how your average American is going to be affected by the stock market crash. So when you look at what happens here, the first big thing that companies do is they're going to start to either lay people off, or they might close factories, or they might cut back on the amount of hours that their factory workers might work, because they're losing money. They need to companies need to kind of stay in what's called the black. So they want to try and stay, above. They want to be making a profit, essentially. So unemployment in America is going to skyrocket quickly. From 1929 to 1930, 1931, employment is going to go through the roof. Now, unemployment in America during this time rises to 25%. So a quarter of Americans are completely out of work. Okay? Now, this is also not a true figure. When you look at unemployment, you have to understand what goes into an unemployment figure, like how they calculate that. So to be considered unemployed, you have to be someone who is actively searching for work. So when you look at this, there's also two other groups of people that you want to pay attention to. So unemployment is somebody who's actively searching for work, but they can't find a job. What unemployment does not take into account are people who lost their job but have given up, and they've given up totally looking for a job. They don't factor into unemployment statistics. So you have 25% of Americans who are laid off from their job, they don't have a job, they're looking for one, and they can't find one. That's 25%. You also have a significant amount of Americans who are laid off from their job, they try to look for a job for a while, but they can't find one, and they just give up. And they're not even calculated into the unemployment statistics. You also have another segment of Americans that may have been laid off from their job, and they might find another job, but they're going to fall into the category of underemployed. You know, they might be qualified to do a much more sophisticated job or to make a lot more money, but they're working at something that either is not paying them the same amount of salary that they deserve given their qualifications, or their hours have been severely cut back at their factories. Some factories won't close entirely their factories, they'll just cut everybody's hours down, which really, to a large extent, hurts everyone. You know, everybody working at that factory, if you used to work, you know, a 50-hour work week, and now you work a 25-hour work week, your family is also suffering. So Americans are suffering in huge numbers. If you add all those statistics up, you have about 25% unemployed. If you add those other statistics up, we're probably talking about 45% of Americans are either unemployed, given up, looking for work, underemployed. So it's a huge effect on the economy and the average American's life. Now, think about what the first thing that maybe you would do if you were in this position and you had lost your job. One of the first things you're going to do, if you had saved money, like during the 20s when times were going well, if you had saved money, what you probably would do is go try and get your savings out, because now is the time. You had saved money. Now is the time to kind of fall back on what you had saved. So a lot of Americans take this approach. A lot of Americans, even though it was a consumer-driven culture of the 20s, a lot of Americans were smart and they saved money to try and, just in case, you know, they needed their savings or they lost their job or something negative happened in their life. Now, unfortunately, you're in an economy that has very little safety nets during the time period. And so what happens is that not only does one person go to show up to get their money out of the bank, many people go to show up to get money out of their bank. Now, once that happens, the rumor starts to spread that everybody's going to the bank to try and get their money out of a particular bank. So more people flock to try and get their money out of the bank. It's the same phenomenon that happened on the stock market with panic selling. So they refer to these as, they're called bank runs. So people are trying to go to these banks to get their money out. Now, what most of you maybe don't realize about a bank is that a bank does not have all of its deposits on hand. It only carries about 15% of the money that, let's say, for example, everybody in our class had deposited their money in a bank. They had a savings account or a checking account in a bank. If everybody who has a savings account in that bank shows up on the same day to take out their money, the bank will not have the money, okay? Because the bank, unlike I think what some of you guys probably think, the bank is not just keeping your money like in a safe place. It's not just like a safe where they keep your money. When you put your money in the bank kind of runs like a business. What they do with your money is they take it and they use it for other things. So in modern day, what they'll do with it is they'll loan it to other people. You know, they'll give mortgages for people who want to buy a house, or maybe a car loan, or people who want business loans. So they're making your money work. And essentially, the people who they give loans to have to pay it back with interest. So the bank kind of works just like a business. They're trying to make money, but their business is lending money out and allowing you to kind of keep money in their bank. But your money is working for them. Now, in this time period, they're also doing a lot more risky things. What they're doing is they're investing the money that you deposit in the bank in the stock market. They're investing it in other companies. So when the stock market crashes, a lot of the banks lose significant amount of money. They also had lent it out to businesses and to people who want to make big purchases. So if everybody goes to the bank at the same time, the bank is not going to have the money. And not only that, they might, in this era, they might never have the money. Because, like I said, the money is out, they've loaned it out. So they're accounting for not everybody trying to take their deposits out on the same day. So when these happen, when these mass panic bank runs happen, you might get to the bank and the bank will be closed, and these are called bank closures, and that means that the bank has just collapsed. The system the bank runs on collapses, and you're never going to get your money back. And so, you have these massive lines of people showing up, and if you were, say, in the back of the line or you got there too late, you would not get your money at all. So you had saved, you had done the right thing, you had put your money in the bank, and you lose it anyway. So when you look at what's going on here, the average American, is losing money, even though they did the right thing. And so we call them victims of bank failure. So it's kind of an awful situation. Now, a ramification of this is that people who lose their life savings, they lose their job, they also can't pay for their houses anymore. And so you're going to have a huge peak in foreclosures happening widespread across the country. Thousands of people are getting foreclosed upon. They can't pay their mortgages anymore. So we see this in the 2008-2009 housing crisis that takes place in the United States. This similar occurrence happens during the Great Depression on an even larger scale. And so massive home foreclosures. So remember, it's a ripple effect. You lose your job, you can't get your savings out of the bank, then you can't pay your mortgage and you lose your house. So where these people end up, a lot of these people, are these places that they nickname Hoovervilles. And these are really just like makeshift shanty towns that develop across the country. So they have them kind of all over the place in Seattle and Chicago. Every big city kind of has a Hooverville. Actually, the one in Oklahoma was huge. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people are living in these little tin shacks, with no building codes, no safety regulations, because they're homeless. They've lost their homes, and this is really the only place that they have nowhere to live. So they're just making kind of these shanty towns to live in. And they nicknamed them after, Herbert Hoover, basically, almost blaming him for the Depression and kind of maybe the poor response to the Depression. So this is Central Park, Hooverville. And then years later, you have a huge expansion of these shanty towns. Now, in the rural areas, it's even worse. We're going to do like a separate lesson on this, but in rural areas, they're also dealing with a major drought and a major problem as far as agriculture is concerned. So they're not getting enough rain, and this is going to ensue something called the Dust Bowl. So a lot of them are facing the biggest natural disaster the country has ever faced, right in the middle of the Great Depression. So you're dealing with two major catastrophic things. And so they're losing their homes, they're getting sick in certain cases, and a lot of them have to migrate out of the Southwest and the Midwest, and they go out to California. So we're going to talk about that, like I said, in a separate lesson. Now, your urban Americans, they're also struggling incredibly. And so what you're looking at here is a bread line and some soup lines and bread lines that Americans were standing on, and basically because this was the only meal they were going to get for the day. And you could just see they're 4 deep, stretched for blocks and blocks because they have nothing to eat, and they would stand there just for their one bowl of soup or their one piece of bread for the day. So the country is, truly struggling during the era. Now, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., part of the FDR Memorial is you have, it's supposed to be symbolize the bread lines and kind of the struggles that Americans went through. So, when we took our JSA uh, club to Washington D.C. for our convention, I find it really interesting because people, they're taking pictures, like they would stand behind these people in the bread line and they'd take pictures of themselves. And I really think that they just didn't understand like what it's supposed to symbolize. It's supposed to symbolize the struggles that these people were going through and kind of experiencing, and how tough and destitute the time period was. So it's always good to have an awareness of the history and like what things really mean, because this is supposed to show like the struggles of Americans during the 1930s and during the Great Depression. Now, just one last thing before we kind of wrap up the screencast. So like personal story. So my family was in America at this time, and so my great grandfather he lost his job during right after the stock market crash, and so like my grandmother, like she had to go to work. She was young. She was like 7, 8 years old, and she would stand out in front of where people were working, and she would sell hot dogs to people who maybe would just try to make some extra money. And she would do that because my great grandfather would ask her to do that because people would have some sympathy for a kid. She's 7, 8 years old, and they'd have some sympathy for her. And there's tons of stories like that throughout the Great Depression. So Americans they're struggling pretty intensely during the Depression. So what we're going to talk about when we get back to school on Monday is how does the government try to fix these problems? And we're going to kind of evaluate Hoover's response to the Depression, and then we're going to talk about our next president, FDR, and his response to the Depression.